Good morning to all. Welcome to our today panel. And first of all, I'd like to thank Eric, Andrew, and Marina to joining us today for this kind of panel and debate about the American trade policy, which is becoming more and more interesting as the Biden administration is going on. So we have seen a series of changes in the international policy by President Biden, especially towards China and Russia. And we are now in the process of better understanding what will be the North American trade policy, actually, from our point of view, or Brazilian point of view. It seems to us that will be a more multilateral view of the trade policy. However, still with some, let's say, protectionism going on by the Biden administration. But anyway, we have our specialists here, Eric and Andrew and Marina, to discuss with us what are the trends for this new trade policy of the United States. Thank you all, and I hope you enjoy the panel today. Ene, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, President Lauro. It's always a pleasure to have our International Trade Committee from Ibrac together. We have monthly meetings, and this month we're gonna have the pleasure of having Andrew Shoyer, who is a partner at Sidley LLP. We have Eric Emerson, a partner at Steptoe Johnson, and as a debater, Marina Isadora Barbosa Souza from Confederação Nacional das Indústrias, CNI. It is a very interesting topic. Last year, we had about 1 year ago, 1 year and some 1 or 2 months, we had a discussion about the US-Brazil relationship. The discussion that we had was pretty much based on the closer relationship between the Bolsonaro administration and the Trump administration. We were discussing whether there would be trade agreements, and in the end of the day, by October, November, the two governments, they reached 3 agreements on trade facilitation, on corruption, and other issues. But the fact is, as poet Carlos Drummond de Andrade would say, there was a stone in the middle of the road. In the middle of the road, there was a Biden candidate that in the end did not allow the Trump presidency to continue. So the whole point here is, okay, 100 days have passed, actually even more than that. And maybe it's already time, it's a good time to know not only what would be the prospects for the Biden administration, but also what are they doing actually. And for that, we have the pleasure of having, as I mentioned, Andy and Eric. So thank you very much. Welcome. And I will give the floor to Andy and to Eric. We did have a organizational meeting, so there are topics that will be covered. And after Andy, Eric will speak, and then we'll have also questions from Marina. At some point, we will have Q&A, so please use the chat, and I'll be moderating the questions that are made through the chat. Andy, thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rene. Thank you, Lauro. Thank you to Ibrac. It's a great pleasure once again to have the opportunity to speak with you. Of course, I wish we were together in your beautiful country, but we'll have to do with Zoom for the moment. In our division of labor, I'm really setting up what I think you'll find more interesting from Eric, but I wanted to talk really first about the US and the world, and in some sense to challenge some of the assumptions that Lauro stated. I think what we'll find is that there is more of a continuum through the Trump administration than a break or a dramatic shift, perhaps except for tone. The substance of trade policy is likely to continue in the Biden administration to be about reindustrializing, and you see that reflected in the Buy America executive order. I think the first or one of the first executive orders that President Biden had published to essentially use the power of government procurement to help to reindustrialize. This is a theme that we had seen throughout the Obama administration. So again, I see this as a continuation. Secondly, in terms of international trade policy, we saw very quickly that the Biden administration reached out and allowed the lack of consensus on the Director General to be resolved at the World Trade Organization. And that was an important gesture to essentially allow the new leadership of the World Trade Organization to take place. But I don't believe, unfortunately, that it really signals a wholesale re-engagement in multilateral rules and an investment in the World Trade Organization itself. Rather, that early signal to join the consensus on the Director General was as much about the Biden administration's policy toward climate change and the need to demonstrate bridge building with international organizations as it was an investment in the World Trade Organization itself. And I think that means that we are unlikely to see anytime soon the Biden administration to press for the re-engagement and rebirth, so to speak, of the appellate body. In order to do that, the Biden administration would need to demonstrate to its stakeholders, labor, environment groups, as well as to Democrats in the Congress, that the fundamental reforms that had been identified as necessary, yes, in a document that the Trump administration published, but those that had been articulated many years earlier, in some cases, again, during the Obama administration, that those reforms are addressed. And so that will be a difficult battle, and it would take significant political capital for the Biden administration to move that forward. And I don't believe that that is a high priority. I think that what we have seen in the re-engagement around the Director General selection, as I say, was really to serve the broader goals of the Biden administration, which are almost entirely on the international level around climate change and to address climate, to reinforce the Paris process, and to demonstrate that the United States is once again a capable and trustworthy partner in the international environment around those organizations. You saw that as well in these, in what was articulated several times, I think, by President Biden in the recent G7, G20 discussions. President Biden is eager to demonstrate, as he said, that the US is back. What that really means, however, on the international trade front, I think is, again, unfortunately, in my view, perhaps less than meets the eye. And I think that the government of Brazil and other important stakeholders should continue to set their expectations lower in terms of the energy and the political capital that the Biden administration will want to invest internationally, at least in terms of the World Trade Organization. Rather, and I think you'll hear more of this from from Eric, the current legal counsel to the U.S.-China Business Council, is that so much of the focus is about the U.S. and China. And so perhaps ironically, somewhat cynically, I think the engine for the appetite for the United States government to re-engage internationally will be really driven by the competition with China. That is, in a way, if you look back to the history of the United States in the GATT, in the 60s and 70s, the United States with the European Commission fought to bring developing countries into membership of the GATT as contracting parties, in large part in competition with the Soviet Union. And so the GATT grew from a rich man's club to a much more multicultural and really a different looking organization, partly because of that competition. And I think as we look ahead, the United States might be pushed to re-engage in the WTO if it feels that that would be a good way for it to try to compete effectively with China. I'm just not sure that that's the conclusion that the Biden administration will reach. And rather, they may look through other means, more geopolitical means, to conduct that competition. But again, it'll be really interesting to hear Eric's perspective on that. Again, I think with respect to Europe, we see some of that as well. So much of what is driving the Biden administration, and we could hear it, I don't think there's any great nuance. I think that the Biden administration, in its recent discussions, was very clear that they want to re-engage as a believable and credible partner with Europe to conduct a meaningful competition with China, recognizing that if the United States seeks to impose restrictions on China's access to high technology, to the next versions of software, and Europe does not, then it will be not just an empty gesture, but deeply damaging to the US economy, because US companies will be denied activity and benefits and Europe will not. So they have to work in concert. And so much of what we've been hearing is to rebuild those bridges in order to conduct that competition effectively. And in part, I think we saw the resolution early on of the long-standing dispute on support for large civil aircraft, in part as a major effort, and symbolic or a symbol of this interest to cooperate. I think that, again, that is what is likely to animate the US policy with respect to Europe. Finally, I don't believe that we are likely to see a significant amount of activity toward the negotiation of free trade agreements and regional trade agreements. Again, if you look at what the Biden administration has on its agenda and what it needs to accomplish, or feels it needs to accomplish, and you all are such careful observers of the US political scene, you know very well that we operate on 2-year cycles, because our next midterm election will determine in part whether the president will have a Democratic majority in either or both of the houses of Congress. Without that, it would mean that the second 2 years of his first term would be very, very frustrating. You know that he has focused significantly on an infrastructure bill, which is difficult to sell because it costs a great deal of money. But politically, in those congressional districts that are going to receive new money for bridges and work, it's often very happy and a pleasant political message to send. So that's something that's easier to sell, frankly, than another free trade agreement. It's very hard for the Biden administration, I think, to try to sell the continuation of the what we had called fast track, the Trade Promotion Authority, to continue it. Ironically, the Biden administration is getting pushed a little bit by members of Congress, certain members of Congress, who believe that, for example, the United States should go back and seek to re-engage with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, now the TPP, that it negotiated heavily and then walked away from. In part, again, this is the theme that you are now familiar with, because of China, because China has made noises that it is thinking about joining. The United Kingdom has already essentially got its invitation accepted to begin negotiations. And so it would be a more efficient process, and it is likely to be something that will be seen by certain members of Congress, at least, as a way to compete effectively rather than to find some other Asia strategy. At this point, 100 days in, the United States this Biden administration has no apparent Asia strategy. They have brought in very, very capable people. They have said that they are conducting a China review, a top-down review. As I said initially, I think the tone will be different, but they have yet to come up with a replacement on the economic side for the TPP. And so that might push them toward that. But remember that any free trade agreement always is difficult to sell to labor and environment. And those are important constituencies for the Biden administration. And again, thinking about those priorities, it doesn't seem that the Biden administration that it will make its calculation in this first term, at least, to pay whatever political costs would be necessary in order to secure a continuing trade promotion authority and to identify any of these agreements. What might change it, again, and I think Eric's comments will be so useful, is really the China piece, because, and I know we will get a chance to talk more about what this means for Brazil, but if, for example, the United States continues to identify one or two African countries, as the Trump administration did, to negotiate with, again, to try to compete more effectively and not cede ports and cede resources to China, then that might be a political theory that they could pursue. But just to sort of close out on my comments, my initial comments, I believe that Brazil and other important stakeholders need to manage expectations downward in how aggressive the Biden administration will be in following along that first symbolic gesture about the Director General to really re-engaging and building back the World Trade Organization, including with the appellate body. That seems unlikely to me to be part of to be an important piece of what has been articulated by Ambassador Catherine Tai as a worker-focused trade policy. I think similarly, we're unlikely to see aggressive use of the political tools to get trade promotion authority and negotiate bilateral or regional trade agreements. Rather, I think the focus will be on trying to push on other tools other than sort of these trade policy tools in order to reindustrialize, to press for a rebuilding after the pandemic of a stronger U.S. economy. And I don't believe the Biden administration sees trade policy the way even that the Obama administration had seen it as a key part of that. So let me stop there and then and let Eric take it from there.
Thank you, Andy. Very instigating points. Eric, without much delay, your turn, please.
Well, thank you very much. Andy is always an impossible act to follow. And So I've had to wear a necktie here in order to be taken more seriously. So I hope that balances out with everybody. Listen, thank you very much, Andy. I concur, as I should, with everything that Andy has said. I think his analysis of where the Biden administration is relative to the Trump administration is spot on. I think that many of us in the trade world expected a major sea change, or perhaps hoped for a major sea change. The 4 years of the Trump administration were the most tumultuous period in trade policy, I think, probably certainly ever, or at least in our professional lifetimes. I think we were hoping for a return to normalcy. I think maybe we were somewhat surprised that that instead of kind of rolling back many of the steps that the Trump administration took, that the Biden administration has really instead kept most of the architecture in place, very much taking a go slow strategy, very steady state. I think the major differences so far, tone, I agree with Andy completely. The tone is markedly different. Multilateralism, and I'll talk a little bit about that, as Andy did too. I think one of the other major differences is predictability. I think that many of us, in the trade space, woke up every morning to read Twitter or the Wall Street Journal to find out what happened the night before. I think there's a little bit less of that now. I think when the administration says it's going to do something, it seems like a normal thing to do, normal within the scope of prior U.S. practice and policy, and then they in fact go ahead and do that. So I think there's a much higher degree of predictability, which is, I think, a positive. Let me focus on China for a little bit. Andy kindly mentioned I currently serve as the legal counsel to the U.S.-China Business Council, following Andy's tenure as the legal counsel in that position. So he's as capable of speaking to these issues as but I appreciate that. I think it's important to sort of look at, where the Biden administration is a little bit through the lens of the prior two administrations. I think the Obama administration, tried to strike a balance on China. I think they tried, we saw some occasionally tough rhetoric on China when it came to things like China's indigenous innovation policy. But at the same time, I think that the Obama administration was trying to view China a bit as a strategic partner, sort of viewed us acting together sort of for global betterment. The Trump administration obviously rejected that altogether and really focused, particularly in its early years, on the U.S.-China trade deficit, and almost saw that trade deficit really almost like a football scoreboard. And, we were losing the game, and so we needed to take steps to try to reduce that trade deficit, which is really what led to the agreement in 2019 between the United States and China, the Phase 1 agreement, that had a number of different components to it. But the biggest and most significant in terms of how it was portrayed by the administration, the biggest and most significant component of that was forcing China to make $200 billion worth of purchases over 2 years of energy products, agricultural products, services, and so forth, to try to change that trade balance, the trade imbalance. So far, China, the second year of those purchases is this year, 2021. In 2020, China failed to meet its targets. It came in only at about 60% of its target. This year, China is doing a little bit better, about at 75 to 80% of its target, but it's pretty clear they'll come nowhere close to the 200 billion they promised. Some of that is COVID related, and some of that was just because it was completely unrealistic to begin with. It's interesting, our Federal Reserve just issued a study about a week ago that noted that the trade deficit with China had actually narrowed somewhat, but when they dug deeper, they found that the reason that the trade deficit had narrowed was not because the volume of China trade had declined, imports had declined, but because the entered value, the declared value of those imports had declined. And that was because U.S. importers were trying to save on duties. And so they were depressing the value of the goods brought into the United States. And once that was accounted for, the trade deficit really remained unchanged over the last couple of years. So it seems to me that the purchase component of it was kind of a bust. But more important, I think, and maybe more instructive for this administration, is the fact that The phase one agreement also contained about 65 specific action items for the Chinese government to take, either changes to regulation or changes to statute that principally had to do with U.S. market access, allowing U.S. exporters to sell more in China. Virtually all of those were adopted by China. They were very specific, and China carried through with that aspect of the agreement. And I suspect that the folks at USTR have learned a lesson from that this idea of trying to force feed China U.S. exports is not an appropriate approach, but this very detailed, focused identification of potential blockages or hindrances to U.S. exports is a much more effective way of dealing with the trade imbalance. So the Biden administration now has essentially inherited this tariff structure, has kept it in place, consistent, all of the same. The exclusion process is over. We still have our 10 and 20% tariffs in place. The Biden administration so far is intently focused on China. They're treating China as a competitive threat really across the spectrum: commercial, military, economic, diplomatic, and are bringing a kind of a whole of government approach to addressing the concern about China. We don't have a complete China strategy yet, as Andy mentioned, but I think we can see from some of the early steps that the administration has taken how they're going to go about addressing some of the threat posed by China. And I think in particular, we see the focus of the administration, particularly from a human rights perspective, on imports from the Xinjiang area of China, the western region of China, which is, we know, is an area where the Chinese government is oppressing the local Muslim population, trying to homogenize them into the rest of the population, re-educating them in camps and so forth. And that's what the press is reporting. The United States has responded to that by blocking imports of products from that region, principally cotton, tomatoes, polysilicon, which goes into solar cells, and are also taking action really across the board. So it's not simply these so-called withhold release orders that are administered by customs to freeze goods at the border, but we also, our Department of Commerce has also put specific entities on the entity list in the export control space. Our Office of Foreign Assets Control has also identified some of these entities operating in the region as a specially designated national, which prevents U.S. businesses from doing business with them. So I think we're seeing in the Xinjiang space a bit of an insight into how the U.S. government in this administration anyway is going to approach China. It's going to be different from the very blunt tool of simply tariffs, but a much broader range of policies. Surely something that the Trump administration was doing in its waning days, although I would argue not particularly effectively. But I think so far this administration is looking deeper into the toolbox to see what they might be able to do to help control some of what we believe to be the worst aspects of China's actions, particularly abroad. The other main difference, and Andy touched on it, I think, or focused on it really, is the idea of multilateralism and trying to address the issue and the problem of China on a multilateral rather than a unilateral basis. President Trump did not take that approach, I think, in part because he was concerned that our allies, particularly in Europe, but elsewhere, that our allies simply wouldn't have the fortitude to hold the line and that they would be weak partners in this fight. And so he therefore wanted to go it alone. And I think as a consequence of that, U.S. consumers paid more for our goods. U.S. exporters were uniquely disadvantaged when exporting to China. Yet many of the gains that we got from this fight in the Trump administration are gains that benefit the entire world. when China changed its regulatory practices, again, to allow more U.S. exports, again, that wasn't really a U.S. specific issue. Those were regulatory changes that benefited everybody. And I think this administration looks at that example and says there's really no reason that U.S. exporters, U.S. consumers should uniquely bear the burden of trying to confront the problem of China. And, as Andy mentioned, the resolution, or the temporary resolution of the Boeing Airbus dispute is a great step forward to trying to normalize relations with the EU so that we can together confront the problem that we face. And so I think a lot of what we see around the world for this administration is what we call fence mending, going around almost on a country by country retail basis to try to resolve some of the problems that were raised in the past administration. So why has this pressure increased? Why the increased focus on China? Well, I think first, the human rights situation in Xinjiang, as it's being reported in the Western press, is simply dire. And I think just as a matter of U.S. foreign policy, generally, human rights is always very high. And I think that particularly in a Democratic administration, they can't put their head in the sand. They have to address that problem. I think that there's now a realization, as there was in the last administration, that the prior hope that engagement with China would sort of make it a more democratic country, would help bring its norms into compliance or into consistency with world norms. I think everyone now realizes that was was kind of a failed idea, and that's really not what's going to happen in China. But almost as much as anything else, I think that we're seeing these very sharp actions against China, in part because the Biden administration itself is facing pressure from Congress within its own party, but also from the Republican Party. And I think that anything that the administration does to look soft on China, the president will be attacked in a re-election campaign, or whoever runs in 2022 will certainly be 2024 rather, sorry, will certainly be attacked as being soft on China if they've been part of this administration. So I think in some respects also the administration's hands are tied, and it needs to take this forceful action against China now. Pivoting just a little bit to the rest of Asia, I completely agree with Andy's points. This administration really doesn't have a comprehensive Asia strategy yet. They are getting the administration officials who've gone up for confirmation hearings have been getting pressed by a number of members of Congress. Where's the administration strategy on Asia? What are we doing? CPTPP is the most obvious tool out there. It is hard to imagine that this administration is going to make any affirmative steps toward joining CPTPP anytime soon. I fully agree with Andy on that point. I mean, just to show how wildly politically unpopular it was, even in the prior election, the Secretary Clinton, as candidate, walked away from TPP, repudiated it, notwithstanding the fact that she was part of the administration that negotiated it as Secretary of State. So it's enormously politically unpopular, and it's hard to believe that this administration would go forward with an effort to join CPTPP, but for China. And I think if China started to make noises about joining CPTPP, I think the administration would have to reconsider that position. I think there'd be a concern that many of the provisions of CPTPP that were drafted specifically to address China's industrial policies, its treatment of state-owned enterprises, would get watered down if China joined. And I think the United States would almost be forced to consider joining CPTPP at that point. Be a very bruising fight, be very politically difficult. The TPA discussion that Andy mentioned would have to come into play as well. But I think the administration might find its hand forced if China really started to take steps as the UK is doing now. Let me just touch on two last issues very briefly. The first are the steel and aluminum 232 tariffs that the administration has inherited. To date, this administration seems to be taking very few steps to try to minimize these tariffs in any way. They were part of an agreement with the EU to try to resolve this by the end of the year. This is a major irritant around the world. But again, as part of this fence mending process, it would be, I think, a way, this is a good first step where the United States goes around the world to try to calm those trade relations. So I wouldn't be surprised to see, on a selective basis, this administration to try to, reduce or remove the tariffs or quotas that are applicable to steel and aluminum products around the world. One small thought, and this dovetails with the comment on that Andy made about climate change being the absolute centerpiece of this administration's international policy. You could imagine a situation where these Section 232 tariffs could sort of get morphed into something like a border tax in the climate context, where countries that are viewed as having taken appropriate steps for carbon reduction might be able, because steel is such a tremendous emitter of carbon, might be able to get those duties reduced, and those countries that haven't would then have those duties remain in place. So, that may be an idea in the back of the administration's mind, is to hold these 232 duties on the shelf, quotas in place, and try to push them into more of a climate context. But that's going to take, that's not going to happen overnight. That will take some significant time. Let me just end here just with a note on trade remedies. The anti-dumping and countervailing duty remedies remain robust. Brazil was targeted in about 4 cases in 2020 and 2021. Certain aspects of the law, I think, are potentially applicable in the Brazil context. And the one area that I think is of particular concern is the currency undervaluation issue. The real obviously dropped significantly in 2020 by about 30%. And the Department of Commerce is now treating currency undervaluation as a countervailable subsidy. It's unclear yet whether that devaluation could be deemed a countervailable subsidy. There's a report to be issued by the IMF in August that will kind of lay the groundwork for whether or not our U.S. government, which kind of follows the IMF methodology, whether the U.S. government might view what happened in Brazil in 2020 as a countervailable subsidy. If so, then that could get folded into future trade cases brought against Brazilian imports. Let me stop there. Let me turn it over to Marina. Marina, as we discussed, please send the easy questions to me and the hard questions to Andy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. And Marina, please, you have our time for questions.
Thank you, Andrew and Eric, for the very interesting perspectives, and Ibrac for the invitation. So let me start with Andy. As you mentioned, the environment is a priority for the Biden administration. Could you please explain how does it impact the U.S. trade policy, and especially the bilateral agenda with Brazil, and what actions could be taken by the Brazilian government and the private sector to address this matter?
Sure. Marina, I think that it's really, the answer is in Eric's last comment, which is, as we're seeing in the European Union, a border tax adjustment is politically and legally, from at least in terms of WTO rules, a very comfortable place for a government to find itself to effect trade protection. Because when you think across carbon intensive products, steel that's, from a Bessemer, furnace rather than from an electric arc, cement, these are highly traded goods. And so politically, in a way, it helps those in the United States who want to encourage the creation of a price for carbon to sell legislation, because a border tax adjustment is an acceptable, as I say legally, it's generally an acceptable way to balance off the burdens that you're placing on domestic producers. And that's where I think Brazil will need to watch the developments, not only in the EU, but in the United States, and to think as well about how it will react. Because, as I say, and I don't want to get into your question is too important for a lecture, but I don't want to lose track of the fact that the paradigm for a border tax adjustment in WTO law is where you're imposing a price of carbon on a good, right? It's a ton of cement made in the United States versus a ton of cement made in Brazil. That's easy to adjust at the border. But rarely do we see legislation that really is designed to do that. Rather, we move quickly away from the paradigm and we start putting a tax on producers rather than the product, or we put it on upstream producers. And so I think what you'll see, Marina, is that this border tax adjustment will play a major role, and in some ways, I think an exaggerated role, given how much it really would be designed to address carbon leakage. I think it will play an exaggerated role in the political discourse in the United States to make some kind of price for carbon acceptable. And so I think it is just another way to impose trade protectionism.
Yeah, just to tag on to that answer just very shortly, I think that, we in the United States, I think now, particularly those in Congress, have become very comfortable with the widespread application of tariffs to imported goods. Seems hard to believe. I think if you were to ask anybody 6 years ago, would that ever happen? And I think we would all have said, no, of course not. The trend is toward trade liberalization, the reduction of tariffs. That's what the WTO was all about, trying to get down to zero. And that's obviously been, completely reversed in the last, 4 years. And so, however it's cloaked, I think that our Congress, there'll be, supporters for the concept, from an environmental perspective. But I think anything that looks like a WTO consistent ability to impose goods at the border is going to be viewed as being very politically popular, as producers politically vastly outweigh consumers in terms of their heft, political heft in the United States. And so I could easily see that being, again, if it's proposed, being justified.
Okay, thank you. So let me switch to Eric now. So Eric, at the multilateral level, there was a joint communication from Brazil and the United States circulated at the WTO regarding the no-market economy practices and the necessity to update their multilateral rules, especially on industrial subsidies. Also, as you mentioned, there is still a trade conflict between the US and China, which somehow has brought some benefits for Brazilian exports. So what is the role of Brazil in this conflict? And should we expect more cooperation from Brazil and the US in order to tackle the no-market economy practices?
So, the non-market economy issue has been around for a long time. And, as we all know, it's a way for the United States to try to remedy perceived distortions in non-market economy countries, of which currently I think there are really only two, China and Vietnam. At least I think that's only two that are involved actively. Belarus in cases as well. There was a big push, obviously WTO litigation, to try to get the U.S. to change its practices. But in the meantime, the United States has also changed its laws to allow for what we call particular market situation allegations to be made. And this is a kind of a backstop in our statutes passed in 2016, I think. And it really allows the Department of Commerce to make adjustments to the costs of individual producers in countries where the Department of Commerce concludes that there's something in the country, whether it's government intervention or some other aspect of the market, distorts a company's cost of production. That was put into law to basically backstop U.S. law. If the United States were ultimately forced to eliminate the non-market economy provision, we would have this provision then to rely on in future China cases where China was a market economy country. Of course, that tool doesn't mention China specifically, and that tool has now been used, just as an aside, has now been used against countries around the world, typically or principally Korea, but European countries, Gulf states countries, and so forth. So I believe that I know China, just as a matter of national pride, wants to have the non-market economy provision kind of stripped out, certainly requires that to be stripped out in any of its bilateral FTAs that it negotiates. But I think as a practical matter anymore, I'm not sure that it will matter so much to individual Chinese companies exporting to the United States under anti-dumping duty cases, because whether they're market economy or non-market economy, I think the Department of Commerce is going to have ample authority to revise their costs to come up with dumping margins similar to those that we're seeing now. So I don't know. I mean, I think that certainly there have been abuses, I think, of the non-market economy provisions by the Department of Commerce, and they've been overturned in a number of cases judicially. And so revoking the non-market economy provision, I think, would be, an appropriate step. But ultimately, I'm not really quite sure what practical impact it's going to have for specific Chinese companies.
Very good.
Thank you. I'll just have one last question for both of you, and
Excellent.
Is it okay, Hannah? Or we're good?
Yes, we do have time. Then I'll have one question from me, and we also have a question on the Q&A.
Okay.
And Lauro, I think, also have a question.
So, Andrew, can we expect the U.S. government to support the Brazil accession to the OECD? And also, can we expect a PTA or an FTA between Brazil and the U.S.? And to Eric would be if he could please comment on the ongoing general system of preference reform that's going on, and what do you foresee as the most probably changes, and what could be the impacts for the Brazilian exporters? That would be my last questions. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, probably no. Yes, on the OECD, the U.S. has not been particularly tough when you look back on, Mexico, Korea, others, similar economies. We'll see. I mean, the OECD is sort of now an important battleground on international taxation, as it has been. So I think the United States might try to secure some commitments that Brazil will support it in some of the key issues that are being negotiated in the OECD. But I think that's more likely than a free trade agreement. And again, I know we saw President Trump and President Bolsonaro, discussing the possibility. As I said, I don't think it's Brazil so much as I think in terms of priorities. I just don't believe that there will be significant energy from the Biden administration to push for those negotiations. Now, I should say, and I think you all know this from the past, we've certainly had significant periods where there was an interregnum, that is, where there was no fast track, there was no trade promotion authority, and yet the administration at the time would negotiate, and then finally that trade promotion authority would catch up. And that, as long as the administration had followed all of the procedures in terms of consulting, the administration was able to present an agreement with a draft legislation and get the up or down vote. So that's still possible with Brazil, even if the Biden administration doesn't push hard for TPA. I don't think that's likely to be a significant. I don't think that's a significant priority for this administration.
Just in one final comment, I very much agree. The FTAs are very, very, very hard. They take a very long time to negotiate. They're politically very bruising. And, even the ones that are, I think, broadly supported, nevertheless take a very long and largely uncontroversial. U.S.-Kenya is a good example, and yet we're still not done. So it seems very hard to believe that we're going to see anything like a full U.S. FTA, U.S.-Brazil FTA, anytime in the future, I would think.
Thank you very much, Andy, Eric. Thank you, Marina. I do have a question, and it's going back to the issue of industrialization. Of course, that the pandemic has put this issue on the table. We have seen governments now having to support the industry, having to provide, to consider providing subsidies. So, and Andy has mentioned that probably there will be pushes on that, and we have seen some Democrat politicians being very, very outspoken on those issues. So, how do you see that going, and what role for the WTO there, especially considering, of course, the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures?
If you allow me, just sorry.
Sure, Lauro.
Just on this, my question was really similar to Rene's. So, but how about this American buying that you mentioned, so like American Buying Act? As far as understood, it is a policy to use the government money power to buy American goods instead of importing them. So could you explain a little bit more about that, and at what level this could be challenged by other countries in WTO, if it is possible to challenge it?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Andy, go ahead, please.
Sure. Maybe I can just take the government procurement angle, and Eric, you might want to speak more broadly on the SCM. But Lauro, so the Article 3, Paragraph 8 of the GATT excludes from the national treatment obligation government procurement. So that was always the idea. Was post 1940s in terms of allowing it was a judgment that the drafters made to allow government procurement to be exempt from national treatment. And so what has filled that in among a relatively few number and mostly developed economies has been a government procurement code first, and now the government procurement agreement in the WTO, supplemented by more aggressive or more preferential agreements around government procurement in free trade agreements. So really the idea is the United States has obligations to other parties to the government procurement agreement by entity, whichever entity of the federal government is purchasing, and based on a certain threshold of the value of the contract involved. And that is preferential in the free trade agreements that the United States has made. So anything that the United States does under this new kind of Buy America push is disciplined by certainly those rules. But that leaves the United States government a significant amount of room, including at the state and local level. And so that's always been a piece that the United States government has been able to use, because again, it is relatively undisciplined in international trade agreements. But Eric, you might want to make a point on the SCM side.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the only thing, again, to your point, Rene, about the stimulus money that's been pumped into the economy, and I think that was your sort of the core of your point, of your question, the money that's been pumped into the economy, I think we haven't quite seen exactly yet how that will be fully analyzed under the SCM. But really, at the end of the day, I think while a tremendous amount of funds have been pushed into the economy to kind of prop it up from COVID, it's really, it has to be reflected in exports. in order for the WTO disciplines to start to kick in. It's not 100% true, but it's close to true. And so to the extent that that money is really just being used domestically, either for provision of services here or otherwise, we may not see a lot of real sort of WTO challenge coming out of it, because it may not be possible for another party to be able to demonstrate serious prejudice if that money hasn't gone sort of directly into the export sphere. I do think it'll be interesting, though, particularly with the China bill that was just passed in the Senate, the USICA bill that was passed last week. The United States is putting a lot of money into semiconductors and semiconductor research and development here, similar to the kinds of support that we found problematic, in the Korean context otherwise. So it'll be interesting to see, that one I think is a little bit different, and it will be interesting to see how that's analyzed. That bill's only been passed in the Senate. House companion hasn't been passed yet, so we don't have a law. But there's a lot of money being pumped into that particular industry, and that one I think is potentially ripe for challenge.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Andy. We do have a question coming from Carolina Bermudes. The question is there still a momentum to negotiate the digital trade agreement with Brazil? One of the questions we got from the Q&A, and I think it will go together with the comments on the FTA.
Again, I defer to Eric, and it's like I think the answer is yes. We've seen that the U.S. continues to negotiate in the digital space. The incentive is really because the U.S. has these significant players, and we're confronting digital services taxes in various countries, and so the United States still in that sector still has a significant incentive to try through negotiations to essentially continue to make the world safe for its really globally dominant players. So I think that would continue to be the case.
Yeah, it's a pretty narrow agreement, much narrower than a full FTA. So perhaps, again, not quite as politically bruising as a full FTA would be. And again, it would need to be, as Andy rightly said, wound up with resolution of any digital services tax issues too. And I do think that the United States has tremendous incentive to try to, either through the OECD or elsewhere, to try to get that issue resolved, for our titans.
Very good. I think we are getting on the top of the hour. We know that in webinars at the moment we reach a certain point, maybe people have their commitments. So I think we came to a point where we can dismiss our panelists, but not without thanking you very much. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Marina, for accepting our invitation for this very, very insightful, informative, and analytic discussion on the U.S. trade policy. And we will, of course, look for you again for future events when that's possible. So thank you all. Thank you for our attendees, and hope to see you all very soon.